we get started, I do have to make a request known to y'all, and I'm saying this now that I'm recording, just so that the people who are listening know that I'm saying this, and so I have documented evidence. Please make sure if you talk, you try to speak loudly, because almost every week I have people commenting or emailing me saying like, hey, we can hear you when you talk, but we can't hear anybody else. And so I just want to throw that out there. If you got a chance, I've tried to turn the microphone more towards y'all and away from me because I have a loud voice. I have a loud voice. Yeah, there you go. Just try to project, right? I don't want to I could be like passing around a microphone and stuff like that, but sometimes that makes people a little bit nervous, and I would rather y'all just feel free to speak freely and not have the pressure of feeling like you're being recorded, but you are being recorded. And so just be mindful of that and just try to project, which is also just a useful thing to do in general, because if you're across the room from somebody, we also have this fan going and stuff. It's good to let people hear you. Fortunately, though, you're not going to have to project too much for one another today because we got a small group today. Because Sean, he is at work. Maverick is doing something with his parents. I think Amanda and Ethan are gone doing stuff because Ethan, he's going back to A&M tomorrow. And then other people are doing different stuff. So it is just us today unless people show up in the midst of it. Hopefully Joseph will show up because there's something I need to talk to him about because he had texted me and I figured it'd be easier to talk to him in person. But that being said, I'm going to open us up in a word of prayer, and then we are going to hop into not only our question of the week, but our proverb of the week. All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you for who you are, and we thank you for interacting with us, for revealing yourself to us, God. We praise you for willfully reaching out to us and your willingness to make us into something other than what we currently are, God. We are sinners who love to rebel, but you are a gracious and good, amazing God who loves to show loving kindness to each of us. So as we go into your word, God, let your Spirit be present with us, guiding us into understanding, and may your word not return void, God. For everybody who speaks, may they be like the prophet Samuel, where not a single word of theirs falls to the ground. And for everyone who hears, let the people's words not go in one ear and out the other. May we be as the people of Israel, who are called to hear constantly, so that we might fall more in love with you and fear you, God. We praise you. We love you. Help us learn to praise you and love you more. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, let me go over here and let me pull up our proverb of the week. Brianne, you haven't been here for a few weeks, and so I don't know if I even told you about this update, but we have returned back to Proverbs of the week as we're going through the book of James, mainly because this is Sean's idea from last week, and he was like, hey, we should do a proverb of the week because James is constantly calling back to the Proverbs, and he just talks like somebody who's writing Proverbs. And so Sean said we should do that, and I told Sean, okay, cool, you're in charge of leading it. And then, of course, he led last week, and then this morning, or yesterday, I think, he texted me and said, oh, by the way, I've got work on Tuesday this week, and so he can't be here. And then this morning, he reminded me about the proverb of the week, and so I threw something together. And I'm not going to lie, one of the reasons I picked this proverb is because I know that Brianne's favorite proverb is in there, and so I figured that'd be a good one to pick. But I also picked it because it perfectly ties in to what we're talking about today. And I actually picked a good selection of them because this is very interesting. Usually when you go to the book of Proverbs, usually like a lot of the Proverbs, they're very individual, right? To where it's like, maybe for the first like 10 chapters of Proverbs, like there's a good flow to it. But then once you get to like the back sections of the book, you'll have one proverb and then you go to the next proverb and it's like a totally different subject matter, right? It's just like a random collection, right? There's not a like certain systematic order. However, verses 21 through 28 here actually do seem to kind of tie into the same thing, and so I picked all of those. And also, just for those of y'all who are watching this online, if you just go to the timestamps at the bottom of the video, like I will put where the James study starts, so if you don't want to do the proverb of the week, just click on the timestamp and you can jump there. But we're going to do the proverb of the week. So, I'm going to read through all this, and as I read through it, maybe you don't even have to have your eyes open. close your eyes and listen, right? And try to figure out what the common theme is behind all these proverbs. All right? Sound good? I'll tell you when to open your eyes. Please don't fall asleep. All right. Proverbs chapter 16, starting in verse 21. The wise in heart will be called understanding, and sweetness of lips increases learning. Insight is a fountain of life to one who has it, but the discipline of ignorant fools is folly. The heart of the wise gives insight to his mouth, and increases learning to his lips. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. A worker's appetite works for him, for his mouth urges him on. A vile man digs up evil, and the words on his lips are like scorching fire. A perverse man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close companions. All right, you can open your eyes. So, wisdom and folly are obviously some prevailing themes in all the Proverbs. But beyond that, is there any particular theme which stuck out to y'all?
A lot to do with the mouth.
The mouth?
The lips, the words that come out of your mouth. I don't know. That's all I got.
Yes. No, that's exactly what we were going for, because that's what we're going to be talking about in James today. The mouth. The power of your words. And we're going to also specifically talk about how that ties into what we've been talking about. It's not totally random. But what does Solomon have to say here about words?
They're powerful.
In what ways?
Your words can either bring health and healing, or it can destroy.
Mm-hmm.
They can put people down, or they can build them up.
Ben over here referencing the book of James already.
Words are like a torching fire.
Yep.
If used wrongly. And then if they're used right, it's sweet to the soul and heals the bones.
Yeah. Yeah. What we'll do, we'll just walk through each of these, not in depth. Like whenever we used to do Proverbs of the Week, we would spend like 5 or 6 minutes on each one. We're not going to do that, or else that would just take a really long time. But let's walk through it and just see what's being communicated. All right. And just so you know, I'm going to ask y'all first before I give my explanation. The wise in heart will be called understanding, and sweetness of lips increases learning. All right. What is being communicated there?
The heart is for understanding. The lips is for learning.
Well, I think understanding, like, remember the structure of Proverbs, how they're always parallel?
Yeah.
Right? So I think that both lines are communicating the same thing. They're just wording it in different ways. So I think understanding and learning here are probably referencing the same thing. What's he saying?
If you want wisdom, go to God to understand it, like for understanding it. I mean,
Okay.
as you know, I'm thinking like I'm tying those things together. That's why I'm like saying it like that.
Mm-hmm. So the wise in heart will be called understanding. Okay, so a person who is wise, they will want to increase their knowledge, right? They are going to be somebody who is willing to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And sweetness of lips increases learning. Okay, so the wise person, they want to learn more, right? And they're going to be somebody who is willing to learn more. A wise person realizes they don't know everything. And then what is it that adds to increased learning?
Sweetness of lips.
Sweetness of lips.
The wise person is sweet.
Yeah. The wise person probably has sweet lips,
Yeah.
and they will listen to somebody with sweet lips, right? Because the wise person, they can help somebody else out with their learning, and they can learn from somebody else. What does it mean to have sweet lips?
I think it's talking about choose your words, like the words that come off your lips, because I mean the words come out of your mouth, but you know they go through your lips and out. So choose your words with wisdom.
Okay.
Like, no, just say what you're feeling, like to go put somebody down. Just say what's right.
Okay. Sweet lips. What do you think it means? I think it just means primarily carefully chosen words, right? Words that are specifically chosen for the edification of the other individual, right? It's not just careless words. It's not bitter words. It's sweet words, right? It's words that are actually given for the purpose of helping learning, right? And a wise person is willing to learn from that.
Like encouragement.
Yeah. And so a wise person is willing to learn from that, and they're also willing to speak it. Insight is a fountain of life. You see how this ties into the previous one. Insight. What is insight?
Like willing to learn or like listen.
Yeah. Well, insight it's knowledge, right? Insight is the result of understanding, right? So if you're seeking to learn, you are seeking insight. Insight is a fountain of life to the one who has it, but the discipline of the ignorant fools is folly. So here you have a proverb that's contrasting something, right?
Yes.
So it's a fountain of life for the one who has it, and if the other person is a person of folly, who is the one who has this insight?
The person.
What's the opposite of folly?
Wisdom.
Yeah,
Right?
with the
Okay,
wise.
so insight is a fountain of life to the wise, but the discipline of the ignorant fools is folly. Right? So basically, it builds up directly after this, right? A wise person pursues understanding, whereas, and that results in insight, and it's a fountain of life, right? The insight that they gain from seeking understanding and listening to sweet words is a fountain of life, right? It produces in them a discerning heart, right? So words result in building the person up and lifting them up so they can go conduct themselves in a wise way. On the other hand, the discipline of the ignorant fools is folly, right? So both people are disciplined, right? The wise person is disciplined in their willingness to hear sweet words and understand and therefore live life wisely. The foolish person is equally disciplined, but it doesn't really tell us what they're disciplined in. But if you contrast it with the previous one, the wise person is disciplined in their pursuit of insight, and therefore the foolish person must be disciplined in their pursuit of ignorance, right? So this person is just going out of their way to not learn, right? And that's folly. The heart of the wise gives insight to his mouth and increases learning to his lips. You see how this goes back to verse 21?
That one connected the two kind of.
Well, it's tied to both of them,
Yeah.
right? Because you have insight, which ties to verse 22, and then you have the heart, which ties back to verse 21, and it's the heart of the wise, right? You have the wise in heart, the heart of the wise. So what does this one say?
The wise person gives insight to his mouth, which then increases learning to his lips.
Yeah.
He thinks about what he's going to say, and then he says it.
Yeah, exactly.
Carefully.
Yeah, and so you see this like self-building thing, right?
Yeah.
The wise person is willing to listen to another person's wise counsel and gain understanding from it. And from gaining understanding, they now have this insight that is like a fountain of life to them. And from that fountain of life, they receive further insight that instructs them on what they should say to other people. Right? You see how this builds up? The heart of the wise gives insight to his mouth and increases learning to his lips. So by listening to another person's lips, he has increased his own awareness of the things that he should say. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. Wow, what does that kind of sound like? Pleasant, sweet. Have we already seen that in previous verses?
Sweetness of lips.
Sweetness of lips, verse 21. So I think this probably explains what exactly we're talking about.
The words you use and what effect they can have.
Yeah. This is Brianne's favorite proverb, right? Or I associate it with you, I guess I should say. Words like honey, right? That's her hand lettering business. What does it mean? Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones.
You want them.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to hear them, you want to hear words that are
Comforting.
sweet, not hurtful words. You want sweet, kind words.
But what does it mean when it says sweet? Is it just talking about kind? Or,
No.
like, is it just talking about words? Because you can have, a foolish person can say words that sound very sweet. That's what the devil did in Genesis chapter 3, right? He came up saying some words that sounded very sweet. Is that him? To be fair, the Bible does call him crafty, which is a form of wisdom. So,
form, but
Yeah.
used to deceive.
so what is it referring to when it says sweet and pleasant words?
Words that edify.
Words that edify? So building up, right? What does it mean to build up?
Encourage is one thing.
That's one thing, right? Sometimes people reduce edification to just encouraging, but encouraging always feels more positive.
I don't know specifically how to describe what you're saying, but I feel like whenever I think of
like words that are sweet. I think that yes, you can be encouraging, but also like I try to put it in the perspective of like the character of God, and like the character traits that we see in him. Yes, he can be someone who's encouraging, but he also is someone who can be like a disciplinary figure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a way to like enact discipline and to like edify somebody else that's with you by like being like, hey, this isn't right, you shouldn't do this, because you're still edifying them without being like sappy, I guess what it means. Like it's not like a sappy sweet, it's something where you're like genuinely looking out for the person that you're talking to.
Yeah, it's words that are genuinely pleasant, genuinely sweet. Think about the imagery of honeycomb, right? Like honey, right? Honey, I like honey all the time. Both whenever I'm feeling good and when I'm feeling bad, right? Whenever I'm feeling good, man, peanut butter and honey sandwich, I'm always there for it. But also, you ever been like, have like a really sore throat and you like get some hot water and blend some honey in there, or just like grab a spoon of honey and just eat it? It like soothes, it coats it, right? It soothes it, it feels good, right? And it can take something bad and make it feel good. That's what words should produce, right? And so I think really this is talking more about the character of the person speaking the words than anything else, right? Because if one person came up to me and they, like, two people could come up to you and they could deliver the same exact message, but the way in which they say it could make it land differently, right? You could have one person and they could come and they could rebuke you and they could do it in the most unloving manner, and you're not going to listen to a single word they say because of how they said it, right? Because their words were not pleasant. Whereas if a person who you know genuinely loves you comes up to you and they say those same exact words to you, but the way that they say it, but the way that they say those words is communicated in a way to where you know that they genuinely have nothing else but your best interest at heart, you're going to listen to that person, right? And so those words are pleasant, right? So I think this ultimately ties back to the nature of the wise person. Also, I got your text. I have read part of it. I haven't read the whole thing, but I figured rather than just reading it and replying, I was going to see you today. We can just talk about it after Bible study. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so I think ultimately this is just going back to the nature of the person, and the wise person, because they have this understanding and insight, they will be able to decide what words to say, right? And they will know how to deliver words. Even if they're harsh words, they will be able to deliver them in a pleasant way, right? So it's almost talking about rhetoric in a way, right? It's talking about how the wise person knows how to deliver these words so that they are received like honey to the person hearing them.
And with the wisdom comes like discernment too. I think that is like a big part of like depending on the person, you're going to communicate that differently, or like the connection that you have with them that like comes with the wisdom is the discernment of how to communicate those words.
Absolutely. Verse 25, going on with your idea of discernment, there is a way which seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. That's another verse that's quoted all the time. Yes?
Of any of the verses in this section, I find myself quoting that verse the most.
Yeah, that's the one that is quoted the most.
Yeah.
It's the one that people, they'll take it and throw it on a bumper sticker or something like that. It'll probably be a discouraging one to put on the bumper sticker. But what's it saying? Hello, hello.
Hey.
What is it communicating? There is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death.
What a person may think is right to him or her, that thing is going to lead them to emptiness, like separation from God, death, like actual death. It doesn't have to be actually like dead, like you're gone.
It could though.
But separation from God.
I think in a way it's like telling us it's the way of the flesh.
Yeah.
And that is going to lead to eternal death.
Yeah, basically it's just talking about the fact that inherently, as humans, wisdom doesn't come naturally to us. There's a way that seems right to us, but if we follow that path to its natural end, it will lead to death, because man's wisdom is contrary to God's wisdom. And we like to rely on ourselves. And if you rely on yourselves, by definition, you are not relying on God. And therefore, you don't have faith in God. And so, this wisdom that we're talking about in context ultimately goes back to the wisdom of God, right? So it can't just be human rhetoric that the people are speaking that come as pleasant words. It has to be words that God decides are pleasant and need to be spoken, right? A worker's appetite, we're going to speed through some of this because we do need to get to James eventually. A worker's appetite works for him, for his mouth urges him on. What's it saying? This is probably one of the trickier ones.
Is So piggybacking off of like 25 saying that like our natural desire is to do like not the wise thing, and it's easy to like fall into that because like everything is going to tell you that you should follow that when really that isn't the wise decision.
Maybe he's alluding
Like-
to like, I was listening to Tony Evans the other day, and he said like going up the wrong ladder, like the corporate ladder, like he has an appetite for work, and he just likes to keep going up the corporate ladder and keeps working and keeps like bragging. He's like, oh, I got a promotion, oh, I did this, oh, I earned another $1 million, and then in the end it's just all vanity.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Like this one, like both of what y'all are saying, it fits. This is one of those ones where I'd have to probably sit and think about it a little bit longer to understand really what it's saying. Like there's different ways my mind is going with it, but some of the difficulty I have, just to be honest with you, when some of the Proverbs, is the whole parallelism thing I told you all about. Like the way that Hebrew poetry is structured is that usually the first line and the second line, they're communicating the same point or a similar point that goes hand in hand. And so you always have to read the second line, like you have to read them both together in order to understand the point, to where whenever I look at both lines in isolation, they look like they're saying different things to me, which tells me that I'm probably interpreting it wrongly. Because on one hand, you have a worker's appetite works for him, which is just saying like, you know, the person who's putting in this work, they don't have to tell their appetite to like be hungry. Like naturally, your body does that for you. So you have this person who's hardworking, but their appetite's doing this for them. And you're like, okay, what point is that making? For his mouth urges him on, right? So the mouth is urging the worker on, and I'm trying to figure out how that ties into what we've previously talked about, stuff like that. But for right now, just for the sake of time, we'll move past it. But there's a verse that y'all can go back to later on and consider on your own time. A vile man digs up evil, and the words on his lips are like scorching fire. What's this one saying? Hey, Mom. Hey.
Person who is evil wants to like produce evil things, and therefore the things that come out of his mouth are not edifying.
Yeah, you see that this is the exact opposite of the wise man that we just talked about, right? So in the first few verses, we've talked a lot about, like really verses 21 through 24 are all talking about the power, like the good side of words, right? And how words can be used for really positive ramifications and stuff like that, right? Words can be pleasant, and they can be like honey. Or you can be a vile man, and your words can be like a scorching fire, right? And everything you do is just, like we know people like this. Right? Like every time they talk, you're like, oh gosh, what are they about to do? Like they're just bringing about drama. They're trying to tear people down. You don't want to talk to them because you know you're about to learn about 5 things to be insecure about that you just didn't even know that you needed to be insecure about until they talk to you, right? This is what people can do, right? To where they live their lives and every word that comes from their mouth is tearing another person down, right? Whereas the wise person, even the words that are harsh can be spoken in a way that does build the person up. Right? So we're not saying that the wise person only says encouraging words. We're saying that the words that they say, even when they might not be as encouraging, they still are edifying. Right? They can still build you up. And then you keep going. A perverse man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close companions. So what do we see here? Kind of once again, you see how it ties to the previous verse.
Just telling evil people doing what they do. Evil whisperer separates close companions.
Yeah. So a perverse man, what is his goal?
Spread strife.
What is strife?
Argument.
Yeah, conflict, right? So a perverse person, he's going out here trying to spread conflict. Once again, we know people like this. Sometimes we are people like this. We don't like to think that, but we can be. And a whisperer separates close companions. So it's making the same point. But you notice how this point is even deeper, right? It's not just stirring up conflict between anybody. No, a truly vile person knows how to pit 2 close friends against one another. Okay, so if you're contrasting this, what does the wise person try to do?
Bring friends together.
Bring people together, right? So if the perverse person knows how to bring pit friends against one another, the wise person knows how to bring enemies together, right? So the reason I went through all of these, I could have just picked one of them, but the reason I picked all of these is because it ties into what we're going to talk about in James today. Because in James today, we are going to be talking about taming the tongue. James chapter 3 is what we're going to be covering. This week, I'm the one leading us because nobody signed up for this week. Next week is going to be Benjamin and Maverick. And just so y'all know, I will not be here at the beginning of next week because we have our open house at the school. And so I don't think that gets out until like 7 o'clock-ish. And then like parents stay after to like talk to you and stuff like that. And so I might not be getting back to like 8:30 if I get here at all. So y'all are going to be on y'all's own. So if you have any questions, be sure to ask.
We'll do our best.
But yeah, so Ben and Maverick will be leading next week through James chapter 4. And then Brianne and Amanda will be in James chapter 5 the week afterwards. But today we're in James chapter 3. And I will just summarize our context for us just because we got a lot to cover and we spent longer on the Proverbs than I originally intended. And one thing that I try to get us to do as we go throughout the Bible is I try to get us to like forget that the chapter and verse numbers are even there, and that the headings in our Bibles are there. Because chapter 3 is a chapter that I think you can understand in isolation on its own. But I think it gets richer if you understand it in its greater context. The issue is I have very rarely seen people tie in chapter 3 to chapters 1 and 2. But I think that it immediately flows out of what we've talked about. And we've got to realize, like, chapters and verse numbers weren't added until hundreds, I think it was like actually over 1,000 years after the Bible was actually completed, right? And we just added those in there just to help it make it easier to reference things, right? It's easier to say James chapter 3 verse 3 than it is to be like, oh, somewhere in the book of James. Back in Paul's day, you know how he said it, as it is written, right? It's in there somewhere. But when James wrote this, he did not say, okay, well, here's the end of chapter 2, now I'm starting a new thought. He was writing a letter. And usually our letters, even when we start a new section, the previous section kind of like ties into what we just said. Because usually we have some sort of structure in our head, and we're like, okay, well, I greeted the person, now I should say this, and you know what, maybe I should build up to the point I'm trying to say. And so there is a structure to this, and so that's why I'm going to always harp on context. Because like I said, you can understand the main points, but I don't want us to understand the main points. I want us to understand the whole letter, right? All right, so James chapter 1, he starts writing, and he is primarily writing to the dispersed Jewish people. He could be writing specifically to Christians, but he doesn't say that. He says that he is a slave of Christ, but he is writing to the dispersed Jews, right? So the tribes of the dispersion, right? The 12 dispersed Jews. And he's writing pretty early on in the history of the church where it's pretty believable, where, you know, they're not so distinct that people would just immediately discredit him. But he's writing just to Jewish people in general, but maybe specifically with Christians in mind. And what is the specific context that he's been addressing starting early on?
It's the whole idea that find joy in trials.
Finding joy in trials, right? That is exactly how he starts it out. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith brings about perseverance, and let perseverance have its perfect work, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Right? So he starts off with basically what I would say is almost like his thesis statement, right? He says, count it joy when you go through hardship, because hardship, if handled rightly, can actually produce like this amazing thing in you where you are just like, quote, perfect and complete, lacking nothing. The idea that you will just feel such rest and comfort and joy in your life that even in the midst of your life falling apart, you can't help but find peace in God, right? And he says that is what can be the result if you learn to handle conflict rightly. And really the reason he seems to be saying this is because he's kind of countering the first century equivalent of prosperity theology, right? Where it seems like a lot of Jewish people at that time were going around saying, hey, if we are faithful to God, things will go well for us. Which you can understand how they arrived there, because if you go to the Old Testament, that was kind of the promise that God made to them under the Old Covenant, right? He said, hey, if you obey my law, things will go well for you in the land, and it'll be great. But here's the distinction. These people that he's writing to are not in the land, are they? No, they are the 12 tribes of the dispersion. Okay, so apparently what God said in the Old Testament isn't applying to them right now because they're not in the land, right? Those like what God said about following the laws and things going well for you specifically tied to you being in the land. These people are not there, so we're dealing with something different. And so these people, they were basically under the idea, okay, well, if we're being faithful to God, things should be going well for us. And therefore, since things are going well for us, we must be faithful to God. And if these other people are going through some severe hardship, that must mean that they're not being faithful to God. Right? It's kind of like Job's friends in the book of Job. Right? To where it's like, okay, well, things are going badly for you, so you must be sinning, and things are going well for me, therefore I must be okay. And James is saying, that's hogwash theology, that's terrible, that's not how this works. Right? And so in chapter 1, he really starts breaking down how God is not showing partiality to people left or right. Right? God makes the sun rise and the sun set on both the righteous person and the wicked person. God will he will give blessings to one person, blessings to another person. And he basically tells the people, don't let your situation around you be an excuse for whether or not you're sinning. Right? Because you can see how this person does that, right? Well, the only reason I did this is because I was put in this one situation, right? This could be the person suffering under trial. Because they're thinking, oh, well, I've already been unfaithful, and I was put in this situation by God, and therefore I did such and such. And he says, no. Everybody is called to be faithful, regardless of what situation you find yourself in. And you can't look at a person's living situation and immediately determine whether or not they are faithful. The way you will know they are faithful is by how they handle the trials that they go through. Right? That is the key. Right? So all because you're rich and wealthy doesn't mean you're faithful to God. Right? How you handle your rich and wealth, that will testify to whether you're faithful to God. All because you're poor doesn't mean you're unfaithful to God. Right? How you handle your poverty will testify to whether or not you're faithful. That's what he's pointing out there. And he continues to go on to where he tells the people that it isn't enough to simply hear the word. Right? You go back, like, you know the story of the people of Israel, like their whole thing is Shema, right? To hear. Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? And so he's basically getting on to them. And he says, hearing the word isn't enough unless hearing is followed by application. And these people, in many ways, the reason why they could say they were being faithful to God is because they looked at their situation and they said, well, look all around me. I've got a pretty good life, and therefore I must be faithful to God. I am a Jewish person. I was born of Abraham. Yes, I might be dispersed, and I might not be living in the land, which is probably a sign of unfaithfulness. I might be dispersed, but I'm wealthy, and I'm a child of Abraham, and I recite the Shema every single day. I hear that the Lord our God is one. And he says, okay, but if you actually examine your life, are you doing the law? Or are you simply saying you're doing the law? Right? To hear the word and not do it, that's not enough. Right? All because you recited the words, Hear, O Israel, doesn't mean you're actually hearing. Right? Because biblically speaking, to hear must lead to obedience. We've seen this like in the shirt that Ben is wearing right now. Right? It says, Hine Shema mitzebak to. Right? Behold, to hear is better than to sacrifice. The way that most English translations translate that is, behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Why do they translate the word hear as obey? Because in Hebrew, one should lead to the other. Right? It's like if a kid is playing outside and the mom says, hey, dinner's ready. And then the kid keeps playing for 30 minutes. The mom comes out and says, did you hear me? And the kid says, well, yeah, I heard you. The mom's like, doesn't seem like you did, because hearing should lead to a change in action. Right? And so basically what James is saying is, okay, you say that you've heard the law, and you think that your living circumstances testify to the fact that you're being faithful to it, but I'm going to argue that you're not doing the law. And so going into chapter 2, what he does is he starts highlighting ways where they are failing to apply the law. Right? These people who are so high and mighty and proud, thinking that they are faithful followers of the law, and that's why they're rich and wealthy and not going through trials, he says, okay, well, how about this? Think about how you look down upon the poor people. So he actually uses the very thing that they tout as their, claim to fame. Look, I am rich and wealthy, and therefore I am being faithful to God. And he says, really? The fact that you think that would suggest that you're not being faithful. Because you are looking down on this other person, and you are showing favoritism. And whenever you gather together at your services, you save a special spot for the rich person, and you totally neglect the poor person. And so your favoritism itself shows that you're not being faithful to God. Right? And so you do need works and you do need to learn to obey, but for a different reason, right? And that's ultimately what he's going to highlight here as he goes into the back half of chapter 2, because he's going to point out, really the whole thing he's been arguing is that application does matter, right? It's not enough to hear, you have to do, which I would say is probably a really relevant thing for us nowadays in the Christian church, right? The Christian church is all about going to church and singing songs on Sundays and saying amen in the middle of services, especially in our Baptist churches, right? We love saying amen, and we love getting up after the service and be like, man, that was a good sermon. But then we go about the rest of our lives pretty much unchanged, which is problematic. But that's because I would suggest that we've probably been promoting a very workless Christianity, right? We just promoted one where it's like, hey, if you just pray this magic prayer, you're good to go with God, which is not anywhere in the Bible, right? Yes, we know that you are saved by grace through faith, but there's not a single example in the Bible of somebody who believes in Christ and is not radically transformed by that belief, right? So it's not the works that save us, but the faith that saves us is a faith that works, right? And that's one thing that James has been arguing the whole time, and everything he's saying is exactly the same thing that Paul says in his books. They're just addressing different audiences. And basically what James is doing is he's trying to give the Jewish people an appropriate and a more proper perspective of the law, right? So they're over here reciting the law, and they're going through the motions of the law, but he says going through the motions isn't enough. It has to go deeper than that. And if you're going through the motions because you're trying to earn blessings and wealth from God, you're doing it for the wrong reasons, because you're not actually serving God, you're serving yourself. And so, back half of chapter 2, he really starts talking about, okay, here's faith, here's works. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, right? It's not like they're separate, but it's not, they are separate, but it's not like works don't matter, right? Because if he's talking to the Jewish people here, and he's telling them, oh, you're failing here, here, and here, and they're like, well, at least we have faith in God. No. You do need works, but not the works you're thinking, right? All because you obey the Jewish law, or try to obey the Jewish law, that's not enough. You need works that go beyond that, because the law itself cannot save you.
I was going to say that they're doing works that supposedly lead to a watered-down faith, and they're supposed to be having faith that leads to good works and having works.
Well, exactly. They're basically using their works as synonymous with faith, right? But in many ways, what he's trying to highlight is that they don't even have the works, right? They think they have the works, but really they're just being satisfied with the bare minimum because they're looking at their external circumstances and coming to the conclusion that they're good, right? Oh, well, I'm wealthy and I'm not going through a trial, therefore I must be fine. And therefore, the faith that I have and the works that I have must be adequate for God. And he says, no, that's not how this works. Instead, you have to go deeper than that. Works and faith are not on the same level, but the faith has to precede it, and that faith is demonstrated through a life of godliness, right? And so, as he gets to the end of chapter 2, he starts bringing up different examples in the Old Testament of people whose faith was demonstrated by their works. He talks about Abraham, he talks about Rahab, and he's just pointing out that these people, their faith was demonstrated by their works, though if you actually looked at their physical circumstances, they didn't have a lot to show for it. Yes, Abraham was wealthy, but for the majority of his life, he didn't have anybody to leave that wealth to, right? Rahab, she was a prostitute, right? And so these people, from an external perspective, they didn't have a lot going for them, and they actually went through a lot of hardship and trials during their life, yet they were faithful. So ultimately, what James is communicating to these people is that if they are over here judging their brother and sister who is going through a trial and immediately assuming, oh, well, you must not be faithful to God, or you are less important to God because you are suffering, well, basically James is saying, that's incorrect, right? And that immediately is going to lead to where we're at in James chapter 3, because how he's going to start this off is by saying, do not many of you become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment. So that's why I wanted to emphasize this, because a lot of times we treat chapter 3 like it's just in isolation starting a new thing, but it immediately flows from what he was just talking to them about, right? These people have been going around touting themselves like they are the aficionados of the law, right? I mean, look at us, because we are wealthy, or like basically they would show favoritism to the wealthy, right? And the reason why is because they just assumed that the wealthy people were apparently being blessed by God and therefore were God's favorite and God's most faithful. And he says, okay, if you think that, then you are showing wrong judgment and you have no place being a teacher, right? Because you are teaching wrong theology and your whole foundation is built on the false premise that material possessions and material wealth equal faithfulness to God. And if they didn't believe this, then they would treat both the rich and the poor equally. And the reason I highlight that is because we have to be aware that we might be guilty of the same thing, right? And I actually, in previous weeks, we've talked about how we are guilty of the same thing, right? If a homeless person were to come knocking at my door right now and to ask if he could join the Bible study, we would probably be a little bit hesitant. But if Taylor Swift came knocking at the door and asked if she could join the Bible study, even people who don't like her would be like, yeah, let her in so that we can at least post about this on Instagram, let everybody know that Taylor Swift came to our Bible study, right? So we're guilty of the same thing, even though that's not even something that's directly associated with like religiosity. That is simply us valuing things wrongly. Imagine it was somebody who was just a successful preacher, right? If somebody from a tiny little church came and knocked at the door and was like, hey, mind if I join in? We'd be like, ah, sure, why not? But if like a mega church, like, I don't know, like Matt Chandler or somebody like, well, y'all know who Matt Chandler is? I'm assuming, I don't know if y'all know who Matt Chandler is. Just a famous pastor, right? If a famous pastor came and knocked in, we'd be like, come on in here, you can have my seat. You know what? You can lead the Bible study, right? We would immediately pave the way because we would think, oh, well, they are successful by worldly means and therefore God must have given them the seal of approval. Maybe, but the thing is, I mean, Jesus, the apostles, Paul, none of them were inherently successful by worldly means. Each of them got killed by the world that they lived in, right? And they got, like, ran out of town. And Jesus preached sermons where, like, thousands of people were there. And by the end, there were, like, dozens. And so if we're simply judging people's success by worldly standards of success, we miss the point. That's what James is addressing right here, starting in chapter 3, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read through verse 5, and then we can actually begin breaking it down. Do not many of you become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment? For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the entire body as well. Now if we put the bits into the horses' mouths, so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot wills. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. So, starting in verse 2 and moving onwards, he is going to kind of shift subjects, but it's not so much a shift as it is him giving an example, right? And so I don't want us to view that as a separate section. I want us to view it as him giving an example to prove his point. All right? So let's start with verse 1. Do not many of you become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment? What's he saying?
He's saying that we are leading by example, and therefore if we lead by the wrong example, God will judge us for the wrong thing we did, and will judge us for showing everyone our bad example.
Yeah. So this is one of those places where actually understanding it out of context can help us better understand it in context. Because if you just read the statement, you can understand what he's saying, and then you can figure out how that contributes to what he was just saying in the verses prior, right? So who is he specifically? Well, he's talking to the people, but what is he telling them?
He's telling them if they become teachers, they'll be judged more strictly.
Yeah. So why is it, like you already kind of addressed it, why is it that teachers will face stricter judgment?
Because what they say is going to affect what the other people do. And if you're affecting other people and you're the reason that's causing people to potentially go away from God or to do the wrong thing, then you've had a significant effect on that because they have seen you as having that wisdom and that you're trying to teach what the Lord has done or wisdom from the Lord. And if you take that as a platform and opportunity to cause people to go the wrong way, like it's going to be largely responsible of you. Is what you taught.
Yeah. No, that's exactly correct. And there's something you said in there that I think that we all understand inherently just by reading it. But what type of teacher is he talking about? Is he talking about like working at a school? What's he talking about?
Religious teacher.
Religious teacher, right? That's what and that's what you said. I just wanted to clarify that just to make clear here. But we do see this as true in general as well, right? Just really it's talking about positions of leadership, but in the context he's addressing, it's talking about religious leadership, right? Because I mean, think about how many bad things happen in our country, and immediately you blame the president. How many of those things the president's actually responsible for? It's probably like a handful of them. But ultimately, all the responsibility goes back to the leadership, right? Whenever things go poorly at a school, they immediately look to the leaders of the school, right? Nobody blames the students. You blame the leaders, and rightfully so, right? It's because when somebody steps into a leadership role, they must recognize what Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, with great power comes great responsibility, right? That's the same point that James is making right here, right? Anytime you step into a leadership role of any capacity, you have to realize there is increased responsibility that comes with that. Which is ironic because a lot of times nowadays we treat leadership and authority as if it's something to be like strived after, and we use authority to abuse it, and we like to gloat in our authority. Whereas biblically speaking, authority is something to be taken very carefully and to be handled well. Yes.
I was going to say in verse 2, he alludes to you just being bound to be judged more strictly because he says, for we all stumble in many ways, including teachers, including normal people.
Yeah, well, that's ultimately where he's going to point out. He's going to point out that every single one of us is imperfect, right? And so he doesn't want you to think in the previous verses that he was suggesting that you have to be a perfect individual. He just says that you need to count the cost before you step into a position of religious leadership, right? Just to be entirely honest with you, chapter 3, verse 1 is the single verse that made me not want to go to ministry. This verse right here terrified me. Whenever I was in high school and I kind of felt the Lord leading me towards ministry and I just didn't want to do it, primarily because of this verse. Whenever I stood at the pier and prayed to God and said, Lord, I give you everything, just don't send me into ministry. This verse was the one ringing in the back of my head. Because this is a heavy, heavy verse if you understand what it's saying. James is saying, you should not all be teachers, right? All because you, let me actually backtrack real quick. This is something that's really sad. Every time an older person sees a younger person studying their Bible a lot, do you know what they immediately say? Man, you should go into the ministry. You should be a pastor. No, right? I mean, maybe if God's calling you to that, but that's not a good sign whenever every time somebody gets passionate about studying the Bible, we immediately say, oh, you're serious about the Bible? You should go into ministry. Well, technically we all should go into ministry, of some sort, but vocational ministry, right? That's not good. If we're immediately oh, you take the Bible seriously, that must mean you should be a pastor. Or maybe we should all just take the Bible seriously. Maybe that should be the solution there, because the body is not made of just a bunch of heads or a bunch of arms or a bunch of feet. No, we all need to have a different role to play, right? But what he's saying here is that all because you love the Lord and all because you know your stuff doesn't mean you should just immediately jump into that role. Only do it if God is explicitly calling you. And that's, for me, that's how I knew that I was probably supposed to do it, because it was the last thing I wanted to do, right? Which is usually a good sign. Usually that's how you know that God's calling you to do something, because if it's something that you want to do, there's always the possibility that your heart is just deceiving you. Whereas if it's the last thing you want to do and you feel like you're really supposed to do it, it's probably not you telling you to do that, and it's probably not the devil. But he's warning you, right? And he's talking to his readers, right? The Jewish people. You should not become teachers, right? A lot of you have no business being teachers, because teachers will be judged more strictly. And notice that he identifies himself as one of the teachers, right? So he is writing as a teacher to people who identify themselves as teachers, and he's saying, some of y'all need to get away from the pulpit, right? A lot of y'all have no business being there. Why? Because what they've been teaching about God is obviously wrong, right? They've been going around saying the wealthy people, they are being blessed by God because they're being faithful. The people going through trials, those people, they need to repent and they need to get back to God because they wouldn't be going through this. Or even if they're not saying that, right? Even if they aren't even adhering to prosperity theology, even if maybe they are simply just treating the rich person with more kindness and generosity and favoritism than the poor person, he says, no. That's not how God would conduct himself. And therefore, if you're going to conduct yourself that way, get off the pulpit. Right? That's basically what he's saying. And so that's how it ties in to the previous section. Right? If you're one of those people that he would be having to correct here, you might need to reconsider being a teacher. Right? If you're somebody who is showing favoritism to people because of something that is not something that God would show favoritism about. Right? If you are simply just looking at them and just making these judgments, that's not the position of a teacher, because a teacher is supposed to be like, they're supposed to have a shepherd's heart, right? And they can't allow favoritism to sneak in. They have to treat every single person equally, right? And their goal has to be to guide everybody to God, right? Regardless of their social status, regardless of their position, regardless of how much money they have or don't have. And so he says, if you're one of these people who is showing favoritism, or who is going around saying that you have faith or you have works, but you don't have both together, you might not need to be a teacher. Why? Because you've got to realize that you're not just going to answer to people about this. You're going to answer for God. One day, every single person is going to stand before God. And we're going to have to answer for what we've done. And that's why this verse terrified me. The reason I'm spending so much time on this is because the verses that follow, they make a lot more sense if you understand this verse right here in particular. And he uses a lot of imagery that we can go through fairly quickly. Why is it that we'll face greater judgment? Chris already kind of talked about it. You already talked about it too. But why is it we'll face greater judgment?
Because as a leader, like Joseph was saying, you're setting the example for the group. You know, like, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a Bible study leader, whoever you are, you're going to be the example for the group that you're leading and your congregation.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you're the one who is teaching people, you are willingly taking that responsibility upon yourself so that when people look at you, they are learning what it means to follow God. And so, if, for instance, a famous pastor did walk in here and I showed him more respect and honor than a non-famous pastor, then first off, I would be doing a disservice to him because I'd be flaring his ego. But also, I would be teaching every single one of you that that's okay. And then, whenever you went and did the same thing, well now, I'm making bad disciples, right? Because now everybody's showing favoritism. And, well, we're doing it okay because David acted like that was fine. And that's a problem, right? And so if everybody's looking at you, like, this means that pastors and teachers and religious leaders especially, and religious leaders of any situation, they need to hold themselves to greater strictness. This is like one reason why I've talked about, for me, I don't see myself ever drinking a sip of alcohol, right? Not because there's anything inherently bad with alcohol. Well, part of it's I have no desire for it. I just genuinely, it doesn't entice me at all. But also, in addition to that, I realize that if so-and-so sees Pastor Dave over here drinking one beer, well, then he might think, oh, maybe 2 or 3 is fine for me. Which, maybe it is fine for him. But what if he saw me drinking 2? Well, all of a sudden, basically, whenever you step into this position, you have to be willing to deny yourself certain things in order to set an example, right? Not that you're holding everybody to that example. You just have to realize that we're going to be held with greater strictness. And if I did anything that became a stumbling block for somebody else, well, I'm going to have to answer to y'all before that. But I'm going to have to stand before God, and he's going to say, hey, remember that one time you did that one thing carelessly? Well, that ended up leading Rocky down this weird path that led him into so many different sins. And I know you didn't do it intentionally, but you did do it, right? And God's going to be gracious with me, right? But the thing is, I don't want to abuse God's grace and say, oh, well, God will be gracious, so it's fine. Well, no. If that's how you're living, you definitely shouldn't be a teacher, right? A teacher definitely shouldn't be somebody who wants to abuse God's grace, because guess what he's teaching his listeners to do? Abuse God's grace, right? And so the teacher should be somebody who wants to please God with everything they have, so that the people listening also want to do that. It should be a person who has faith and works that back up the faith, so that the other people will do that as well. It is a person who doesn't show favoritism. That's what he's saying a teacher needs to be. And that's why he says, be careful, because not everybody should be teachers. And this is very relevant for our culture nowadays as well. A lot of times in churches, we hire people more because of their communication skills and their rhetoric and their charisma, more than we do for their actual personal character. Which I don't think we should be surprised whenever we see all these different like scandals coming out in the churches, because that's not what we interview people about, right? We don't look at their lifestyle. We just look at, clips on YouTube of them preaching. We're like, wow, they really know how to speak. That doesn't make a good pastor, right? I would much rather a pastor be up there stuttering left and right, but genuinely caring for the people and living a life of holiness than somebody who's just super charismatic but a wolf in sheep's clothing, right?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so when it comes to like what the line is when it comes to being a teacher, because I was thinking about like whenever you identify yourself like as a Christian, from that point forward you become a steward for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And everything you do should be pointing to Him. Like we're called to live a life that's set apart. So even if you're not like a pastor or like a youth leader or like someone who's necessarily in like leadership, our like actions, like we're still teaching the people that are our peers or like people that are around us. So like what is the line of like what He means by a teacher?
So
you know what I mean?
I think really if you're just wanting to get a general principle out of this, he's saying tread carefully when it comes to seeking higher office. Right? If that makes sense. Now, like we live in a culture nowadays that's always about seeking the next promotion, always seeking to become greater and move your way up the ladder. He's saying tread carefully. Right? So I don't think he even had I don't know if he has in particular like pastors in mind or anything. Like the church at this point did not have all the different structural things that we have nowadays, right? This is like 15 years into the church even existing, right? I think right now he's probably just got like a rabbi in mind, right? Somebody who is willing to speak somewhat authoritatively about how to interpret the Word of God, right? But you're right. All of us should be functioning in a way that is an example to one another, but he's just saying, remember, with great power comes great responsibility. And so the greater the power, the greater the responsibility. So a lot of people, they're like, oh man, I'm a Christian, I'm gung-ho for Christ, I'm going to just like jump in and just start teaching everybody. Be careful, right? Like think about it, whenever Kanye first did his whole like Jesus thing, right? Immediately, all these churches took him and they put them on the stage and like let him preach. And that made me very nervous. Because I was like, I don't know where this is heading. This dude has said he is a Christian for about 2 months. And now you are giving him an international platform. Well, now churches aren't really doing that too much, right? Because he's doing other kind of strange things now. Well, that kind of backfired, right? Because think about that. Now that backfires on people's, like, think about if people came to Christ because of Kanye, and now they see some of the stuff that Kanye's doing, well, that's a big stumbling block to them. And so it's good if they came to Christ legitimately because of Kanye. That's great. But it also set them on the pathway of possibly becoming even antagonistic against the church because it seemed like it was just a big fluke, right? And so you should be hesitant to just throw people there, but the only reason they did that is because he was famous, right? So that's actually probably a perfect example of everything he's talking about here. Oh, well, this person's wealthy and now they're a Christian. Let's give them a platform. No, not everybody should be teachers because we will be judged with greater strictness. I was actually reading about this in Deuteronomy today, where Moses gives a commandment about kings. And he says, hey, you're not supposed to have a king, but inherently, whenever you go into the land, you're going to want a king because you're going to want to be like the nations. But when you appoint the king, he must not multiply horses, he must not multiply wives, and he must not multiply much silver or gold. Why? Because that's what all the other kings do, right? But he doesn't say that, I mean, technically, a lot of those things probably apply for the general public as well, but he specifically highlights standards about kings because he realizes that the king will be the standard for the people, right? So the people of Israel were already supposed to be holy from everybody else, and they're supposed to be holy towards one another, but whenever you have a king in charge, well now he's the standard bearer of everybody else now. And so everybody's looking to the king to figure out how seriously they should take God. Same thing here, right? So the higher you go up, whether you are a deacon, whether you're a pastor, no matter what you're doing, if you are in the limelight, there's greater responsibility there, right? And that's just what we have to be aware of, right? So don't be constantly chasing after promotions, and the Christian should not always be like, ooh, I just want to be in the public. being a celebrity pastor is not always the best thing, right? Like that's actually one thing. I know that we're spending way too much time on this. That's okay. We'll get over it. There's a lot of celebrity pastors right now I feel horrible for, right? Because they were very charismatic and they built a huge following, but now there are certain things that they simply. I'll explain what I mean by this. There's things they can't get away with that a less prominent pastor could get away with, and I don't mean get away with in like some like conniving evil way. I'm saying like legitimate things where like this celebrity pastor, they will stumble in the smallest way, right? But because they're in the limelight, now they're being canceled, right? And they are being like pushed, like now they've lost their ministry, they're fired from their jobs. Whereas if they were just a small pastor of like a local church, the congregation would have forgiven them and they would have moved on, right? And so that's what he's highlighting, right? If you step into prominence and you just jump at it, you better be prepared for the follow-up, because you'll be held in stricter judgment by both man and God, right? So be ready for that. And now he's going to give an example of how this is true by looking at the most basic form of obedience, your speech, right? When it comes to actually obeying God, there's a lot of things that he calls us to do, but the most basic thing we can do is literally just control our tongues, right? I mean, that's like the most basic thing. It's like the first thing we do, right? He calls us to hear, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? He has said it's not enough to hear, you have to do. Well, what's the first step for going to hearing to doing? Speaking, right? I mean, that's the closest thing to your ear when it comes to action, right? So he's going to say, let's just start with the mouth. And let's just talk about how your mouth itself can lead you astray. And if you can't control your mouth, you probably shouldn't be a teacher. How much more the other stuff in your body? So, do not many of you become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment. So he has willingly stepped into this teacher role knowing that he will receive stricter judgment, and so he's going to hold himself to a high standard. James goes down in history as known as James the Just. Even amongst his Jewish contemporaries, he was known as being like holy of the holy. For we all stumble in many ways. He acknowledges that none of us are perfect. We live and we learn it again and again until we get it right. To quote Hannah Montana. We all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the entire body as well. What's he saying there?
If you can control your mouth, or if you like don't stumble, then you're able to control like everything. It's not just one thing; it's all of it.
Yeah, he says if you don't think you stumble, then you must be entirely in control of every single aspect of who you are, which nobody would claim, right? But you see how this ties into what he was previously saying? These people were looking at their lives thinking that they were being faithful and doing all that was necessary to obey the law, basically. And he says, no. Right? If you were truly a righteous person in and of yourself, you would be able to be like this, right? You would not stumble in any way. You'd have everything in check. But you're not. And he's going to highlight that through talking about speech, right? If you were truly righteous and you weren't stumbling at all, you would have your entire body in check. But what I'm going to argue is that you don't even have your mouth in check. So how can you claim to be truly righteous before God? Your actions don't make you righteous. It's the faith that makes you righteous. But the actions you do should not be with the goal of being righteous. The actions you do should be flowing from your faith, right? It should be the devotion towards God that makes you want to live righteously, not because you're trying to earn something from Him. Because if you're trying to earn something from Him, you're not serving Him at all. You're serving yourself. So he says, nobody, like, basically just from verse 2, everybody knows that they can't do this, right? Nobody has their body fully in check. He's just going to start with the most basic example. Now, if we put bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. So what's he saying there?
The bit is small compared to a horse.
Yeah, it's imagery, right? So you put a bit in the mouth of the horse, right? It's really small, but once you do that, what happens?
You can control the horse and where it goes.
You can control the whole horse. So what point is he making?
Be careful what you speak.
Yeah, it starts with the mouth, right? The mouth controls the whole body, which makes sense given what we were just reading in Proverbs, right? Yes, the mouth can do great things. It can do horrible things. The mouth can get you into situations. It can get you out of situations. It can give people wisdom. It can give people folly. Right? The mouth is what is used to hear. The mouth is what is spoken so that a person can hear.
Yeah.
Right? You use your ears to hear. I wasn't.
Yeah.
I know how the body works. I promise. Now, if we put bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. So notice how leads to obedience. Okay. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, they are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot wills. All right. What's the imagery?
A ship.
A ship.
Boat.
And how is it steered?
Rudder.
By a tiny little rudder. But it governs the whole ship. All right. So if you're looking at both of those two examples, what do they have in common?
Something small is in control of
Something.
the larger picture.
Yeah, a really big thing being controlled by a little tiny thing. So also, the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. So he says, all right, you think you have your entire body in check? Okay, well, there's a lot of examples of things that the whole is governed by a tiny little thing, so let's maybe just start with your tongue. If you can convince me that you've got your tongue in check, then maybe I'll believe you that you've got your body in check. Moving on. Behold how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our existence and is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beasts and birds and reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not be so. Does a fountain pour forth from the same opening fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. He uses a lot of imagery, doesn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's saying when you speak against God, you're like essentially speaking fire from hell.
Okay.
In a way, and he's also saying like same mouth we use to spit fire, we use to praise God. And then he goes like, this cannot be. And then he gives analogies to produce that, like, or prove that, like, can you get salt and water or fresh and bitter water from the same fountain? Can a fig tree produce both figs and olives? Well, I guess nowadays that one is possible if you graft, but back then it was impossible.
Yes. Okay, let's walk through it. Behold how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. What's the imagery?
That your mouth is powerful.
No. The imagery.
Forest. Fire.
Forest?
Little tiny fire making the whole forest burn.
Yes. I mean, isn't this what we've been talking about this summer with all the different fires going on in like Canada and then what, like down in Maui and stuff? It didn't start with the fire being that big. It started with a tiny little fire. But what happened to that fire?
Grew.
Spread.
It grew. How did it grow?
By the way.
Wind.
Wind.
The flames were like contagious. It just
Yes. Ultimately, what I'm trying to get at is that nobody controlled it. Right? Nobody could rein it in. Right? The fire got out of hand. And so it started off as a small fire, but then very quickly became huge. Right? That's what he's saying can happen with the tongue. You might think that you know the power of your tongue, but think about it. Like, you've seen this in your own life. That's where he's going to head with this. You've seen this in your own life where your tongue has gotten the best of you, but think about the ways you don't even know. Where maybe you said something to another person, and you don't even know where they went with what you said. Right? You simply know the times when you've messed up. But maybe you said something to somebody else, and then they went, it's basically like a game of telephone, where it just eventually turned into something totally different. Or you told somebody, well, you know what? God never gives you more than you can handle. And then they were like, really? And then they were going through something way more than they could handle, and it led them to totally abandon God. Because they said, well, I know that God never gives me more than I can handle, and this is a lot more than I can handle, therefore God must not be real. All because you said that one thing to them 5 years earlier. It's like, whoa, we don't even realize how far words can go, right? Somebody can make a statement to you, like just like a little comment about like something on your face, and you're insecure about it for 30 years, right? Meanwhile, usually it doesn't happen the same way with compliments. Usually a compliment you'll forget like 2 seconds later, right? But this is what he's saying with the power of words. It's like a fire, right? It starts with a small little spark, and by the end, like literally the sky is red in Manhattan, right? Did y'all see those pictures of like the Manhattan, like with the Canada wildfires and stuff? It's ridiculous. Like go look it up later. It's like the sky is literally orange in Manhattan, and it's absolutely terrifying. It looks like it's out of like a post-apocalyptic movie. Like people just woke up one morning and they're like, "What's going on?" It was weird. The tongue is a fire, the very world of unrighteousness. That's how he describes the tongue. It is the world of unrighteousness. Like you want to know where unrighteousness starts? Right there. Sure enough, where did sin begin, biblically speaking? It started with eating a fruit, but go before that.
It was words, right?
Words, right? Yeah, the servant showed up and he spoke, right? And then they heard, and it led them to disobedience, and they ate, right? And then God confronts them, and they use their words to try to deceive God, right? So it always starts with words, right? This is the very first thing that leads us into destruction. The tongue is a fire, the very world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our existence and is set on fire by hell. Right?
Ouch.
Like, I would actually dare you to name like one sin that doesn't ultimately trace back to words. Right? Like, even like lust. Like, the reason why we might be attracted to certain lustful things and might be willing to embrace certain things is because somebody has taught us that it's okay somewhere in his, like, somewhere back there, right? We might desire these things, but the reason we embrace them is because in some way we have the words to justify it in our heads, right? Words are really almost at the root of all of this. Yet, words are the things we so often neglect. I know a lot of Christians who care about righteousness in so many ways, yet the words they say are careless, right? Because for some reason we just don't think about our words being that significant, or we care about words in the wrong way. Right? We care a whole lot about not saying cuss words, which I don't say cuss words or anything like that. But I would say that is probably one of our least concerns when it comes to words, right? Because ultimately, like those are just like words that our culture is just like deemed as bad words, and the reason we don't say them isn't because like God said not to say them. It's simply because like since they're recognized as bad words, it's probably just good for us to stay away from them, right? But think about how often we're so quick to say, God told me to do this. We just put words in the mouth of God. Are you willing to die on that hill? Right? That's false prophecy, my friend. Unless you're confident that God said that, right? Or we might just say something to a person not realizing that we've just ruined their day. Right? Words we're very careless with, and the only words that we really do care about are usually the ones that aren't actually that significant to God. The tongue is a fire, the very world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our existence and is set on fire by hell. I think a really good example of this, I listed this whenever we were going through James with my high school students last year. At the time I was reading through Romeo and Juliet, and we recently watched the movie. And one cool thing about Shakespeare is his use of words, right? And I was just thinking about how that whole movie is just driven by words, right? You've got, on one hand, you've got Romeo and Juliet, who they had the whole encounter. Do y'all know the story of Romeo and Juliet? Roughly, right? It's kind of a love story. But they meet each other at this party, and then that same night, Romeo ends up encountering Juliet at her house. They have that whole balcony scene, and the words pouring forth from Romeo's mouth are the most romantic words in the world. They sound kind of weird nowadays, but the stuff he's saying, he sees her resting her face on her gloved hand, and he's like, "Oh, to be the glove on that hand that I might touch that beautiful face." It's really corny and romantic, but everything he says, the words are golden. If she could hear him saying those words, and sure enough, they do meet up with each other a little bit, and he gets to say these type of words to her, there's a reason they fall so madly in love with one another so quickly. It's because how powerful their words are. On the other hand, you've got one dude from Romeo's family and one dude from Juliet's family who are constantly feuding with one another, right? Tybalt and Mercutio. And at one scene in the movie, or in the play, they walk by each other and they just make a passing insult to one another. Just an insult. They do this all the time. Usually it's just in jest, right? They don't like each other, but usually it's just in jest. But this time the insult lands too hard. And all of a sudden, just a few minutes later, they've drawn their swords. And then Romeo comes along and he has to defend his friend. He ends up killing the other dude. And then Romeo has to go on the run. And then Juliet's like, what the heck's going on? And then you have the whole star-crossed lovers thing where by the end of the story, both of them are dead. Romeo and Juliet. It all started with words, right? On one hand, you had Romeo and Juliet saying such powerful words together that their story goes down as a love story despite the fact that it ends with like double suicide. That's crazy. Like, that's how powerful the words are, because regardless of where the rest of the story goes, you look at those words and you're like, wow, that's romantic. On the other hand, the reason the whole story is undone starts with words. And so words both produce the highest points of the story and the lowest points of the story. And they govern the whole story, right? Perfect example of it, right? That's what James is saying here. For every kind of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. So what's he saying there?
Nobody can keep control of the human mouth, the human tongue, mainly.
Yeah, but what's the imagery?
Poison.
It reminds me of like Genesis, like whenever it's talking about all the different things and God gives like man dominion. He's like from the like very beginning of time, like man is able to control other things, but he can't even control his own tongue. That's
Yeah.
like
Yeah, he can control everything else, but he can't control himself. And you already listed an example of this, right? You put a bit in the mouth of a horse, right? Think about how big horses are and how useful they are, right? I mean, like, think about how much faster. I mean, they didn't have cars back then, right? You got on a horse, well, now you can travel so much further across the world than ever before, right? This is crazy. All because they put this tiny little thing in the mouth. They realize that if you want to control the horse, you start with the mouth and then control it. But we haven't learned how to control our own mouths yet, right? So we've learned how to control everything else. But what we've recognized with other things, we haven't recognized with ourselves. With a horse, we recognize you want to control it, start with its mouth. But with us, we forget about the mouth. We try to control everything else. But I think what he's saying makes practical sense. If you're actually wanting to live righteously before God, and you actually want to please Him, don't start with some huge thing. Start with something small. Because this will make you more mindful, right? If you're actually thinking, okay, without being quick to speak, slow down. Does it honor God if I say this next sentence? Okay, well now all of a sudden, if you're thinking about every sentence you say, you're probably going to be thinking about the bigger stuff too, right? So if you can just start with your mouth, well, there you go. Whereas these guys over here, they obviously didn't care what they were teaching, right? They're out there teaching all this other stuff, and that's why he says, hey, maybe y'all shouldn't be teachers because y'all obviously don't have control of your mouth. Because the stuff you're saying is not glorifying to God. You are teaching people to be partial. You are teaching people that they are sinning against God if they're going through a trial. When really they should be rejoicing because God is trying to shape them through that trial.
Yeah.
Right? You are leading people away from God by governing them according to human wisdom, not godly wisdom. So you're over here claiming to be faithful to God when really you haven't even begun to be faithful in the smallest part of your body. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. So here we see the duality between what's accomplished with the tongue. On one side, what do?
Bless.
We bless God, right? We worship Him. We go to church service, we're like, amen, hallelujah. God is great. But then what do we also do?
Curse.
Curse who?
Other
Other people are created in the likeness of God.
Yeah, other people. And usually, these things aren't always separated by that many minutes, right? You have to realize that cursing here, like I think he's using extreme language, just because he's highlighting the two ends of the spectrum. Think about this, when you're like praising God the whole, you go to church service on Sunday, you're like got your hands raised, you're like, amazing. Like, this is great. Love God. And then, like, 5 seconds later, you're like, you know, does it seem like the worship leader was just a little off pitch right there? It's like what just happened? Like, 5 seconds ago, you were singing along with him and praising, and now you're criticizing him. Right? And sometimes criticisms are valid. He's just pointing out that we do both. Right? And the tongue can be used for both. On one hand, they're over here saying, we are faithful to God, but then they look down upon the poor brother amongst them, who is also being faithful to God and who is probably being more faithful than they are. Right? Because he's counting it joy amidst his trials. Whereas for them, if they were to go through trials, they would immediately try to get out of it because they think that they're being cursed by God because they're being unfaithful. Right? And so you can't have it both ways. Right? You have to realize that we are hypocrites. That's what he's trying to get across. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Right? This is a contradiction. On one hand, you're claiming to be this devout, righteous person who loves God. But on the other hand, you're not. This was really easy to prove with my high school students, because I was like, guys, all right, y'all sitting here with me for 50 minutes for Bible class, and during these 50 minutes, y'all are pretty good at like staying focused and talking to me about Bible and being like, oh yeah, like God is amazing and we love God and like we should do this, this, and this, and we should we should be faithful. And then I can hear them out in the hallway when they think that I can't hear them. Right? And they immediately walk out there, and I can just hear them gossiping about one another, and like just talking bad about one another. And I'm like, that's the great thing about high schoolers, is that like they just don't realize the like the disparity. I don't think we do either, but they're in like the perfect environment for it to just be put on full display. Right? Nowadays, it's like usually we like travel with different groups, whereas with them, especially in a private school, it's a small group. So like I get to see like them like with one group, and they're like all friends, and then like out in the hallway, it's like, oh wow, you acted like that person was your friend. And I don't talk about my friends that way, right? And so we do both. And he says, one of these things is not like the other. Either you're being faithful to God, or God approves of that, and I don't think God approves of that, and so maybe the conclusion is that you're not being faithful to God. Yeah?
I was just going to allude to you can't serve two masters. You can't set a table of the Lord and a table of demons.
What's that?
With it we bless our Lord, and with it we curse other men.
Mm-hmm. No, I just didn't hear what you said.
I was going to say you can't serve two masters. You can't sit at the table of the Lord, and you can't sit at the table of demons at the same time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like whenever you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says you can't serve both God and money, right? The ways of the world, right? You can't straddle the line and say, oh, well, I want to serve God and serve the world. That's what people like to do, right? They'll be like, well, yeah, like, I mean, I'll give Jesus his time over here, and then like the rest of the time is my time. It's like, no, that's not an option, right? You either are all in for God or you're all in for the world. If you're straddling the line, well, then you've chosen the world because you've basically decided that God is not worth abandoning the world for, right? And he is. And so either you have a false view of God or you have too high a view of the world, in which case you chose the world, right? It's all or nothing. And so if you are both blessing God and cursing others, well, we've got a problem. And once again, he started off this whole thing by saying we all stumble in many ways. So he's not saying he is perfect. He's simply saying that if we don't even notice this problem within us, we've got a real issue, which these guys didn't, because they were going out there and they were acting like they were faithful to God when they were also looking down upon their brothers, and they were calling themselves hearers and doers of the word. Whenever he's like, no, you're just hearers. You need to start doing. And whenever I say works, I'm not talking about just like walking through the motions. I'm talking about a works that is accompanied by faith, right? That's what he's getting on to them about. My brothers, these things ought not be so. Does a fountain pour forth from the same opening fresh and bitter water? What's the answer to that question? No. That would be impossible, right? Because immediately, as soon as the bitter water makes contact with the fresh water, what happens? It all becomes bitter, right? It might be a little bit diluted, right? It might not be as bitter as before, but it's still bitter, right? When it comes to the two, one overpowers the other. Fresh water and bitter water, the fresh does not win out, right? Just a little bit of pollution pollutes the whole thing. Same thing with our speech, right? All that worship that, like, you get, like, especially, I've got so many things I want to say because this passage is really cool. We give God an hour of worship on Sundays. And then basically the rest of the week, we just go say whatever we want. right? It's not even like, it's not even, right? It's like a little bit of fresh water with the rest being bitter water. Like the one time we're actually somewhat mindful of what we say is usually whenever we show up to church. And even then, I don't even like when we do that, because usually the stuff we're being mindful and saying is not actually like what we genuinely want to say. We're just like going through church speak. Oh, God bless you, brother. How are you doing? Doing great. Thank you for asking. Like, it's not even like genuine conversation. But the reason we do that is because we realize, wow, if I talk to everybody the way I talk to them, like I talk to people outside of church, they probably think I wasn't a good, holy individual. So I better put on my church face whenever I go to church on Sunday and talk different. If you have to talk different to people when you show up at church, that's probably a sign that you need to start talking differently outside of church. So that ideally, when you show up to church, you're talking the same way you do outside of church, because both should be honoring to God. That's what he's highlighting. But you see, like, I'm not the only person who goes to church and sees people doing this, right? Like, that's one thing I really do appreciate about, like, First Baptist Seabrook. I don't really see anybody doing that too much. To where you talk to them, and I'm like, no, this is just like, this is how you are inside and out of church. That's great. With all the blemishes that includes. Yes, Ben?
If I gotta be honest, I act different in certain situations. If for me personally, I act different, which is not good, and I'm asking God to help me.
Well, it depends on what you mean by act different. I mean,
like,
sometimes like
an attitude, like I'll be one way at work, and then when I come home, I'll be a different way, and then when I come here, I'll be a different way, and then
yeah. Well, it means on what, like, it depends on what you mean by acting different. Like, if your entire character is changing, then we've got a problem. But like, if like sometimes like I don't know, like
more shy situations.
Well, yeah, like for me, like leading this Bible study, I will be talking a whole lot more, and I'll be more extroverted than I would like if I was going to somebody else's Bible study. Like whenever we went to Dallas's Bible study a few weeks ago, I didn't even say a single word. I literally just sat there and was like, cool. And then like got up and like we left. Right? Like that's fine, right? That's like read the room, use discernment. Like for that Bible study, I could have said stuff, but I chose like, well, no, like this is like, it's not my Bible study. I don't want to take over this thing. You can act differently in situations. We're mainly talking about character here.
Character, yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like if you're acting like how you act at this Bible study, and then like you go to work and you're just like, hey, what's up, losers? Then we have a problem, right? Because then you're being a totally different person, right? You can be the same person, but conduct yourself differently in different circumstances. Jesus did this all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, whenever you look at Jesus, he interacted with the Pharisees different than he did with his disciples. And he interacted with both of them differently than he did with, like, the tax collectors and sinners. Right? You can conduct yourself differently because that's part of using wisdom and discernment. Right? What you don't want to do is have your character change. To where, if all the people from all the different situations were to get together, they might disagree on how you conduct yourself, but they'd all agree about your character. They'd be like, you know what? Yeah, he's a bit more silent here. Really? He's really talkative where I'm at over here. Okay, but can we both agree that they're like a really stand-up person who, like, when they do speak, it's glorifying to God? That's the important thing, right? It's about the consistency of character. Yeah, it's about the heart behind it. Yeah. Does the fountain pour forth from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? The answer is no. Because if it even tried to, the water would immediately dilute. And what it implies, notice this, just with the imagery there. If the fountain is pouring forth both fresh and bitter water, well, that means that the fresh and bitter water probably wouldn't just begin mixing right there, right? It means that they were sourced by something deeper that had already mixed, right? So if your mouth is pouring forth both blessings and curses, well, that probably implies that there's something deeper inside of you that is also split between two masters, like Joseph was pointing out. Can a fig tree, my brothers, produce olive trees, or a vine produce figs? No, right? That's not how things work, right? Yes, you can graft things. They could graft things back then too. But he's talking about by natural means. Grafting, by definition, is something where you have to step in and like force it to happen. He's talking about by nature, right? Can a fig tree produce olives? No. What does a fig tree produce? Figs. Good. Can a vine produce figs? No. What does it produce? Olives. Right? Okay, so if you're a Christian, what should you be producing? Righteousness. Words that glorify God, right? And that's just starting with your words. It should go beyond that in your day-to-day actions, right? But what he's pointing out is that the words are where it all starts. If you can't get your words in check, how can you expect to get everything else in check? All right. Nor can salt water produce fresh. Right? In the same way, salt water doesn't just be like, oh, you know what, I'm going to produce fresh water. No, it doesn't happen that way. Right? Like produces like. If your speech is unrighteous, then you've got a deeper issue you need to address. And so if these guys are going around teaching things that are contrary to what God has actually taught, then we got a deeper issue, because apparently you don't understand God, and therefore you have no business being a teacher. Right? He's not saying that these people are not saved. He's not saying that these people can't grow better. He's simply saying you shouldn't be a teacher because you're producing stuff that is not in line with biblical theology. And therefore you need to take a step back and figure out what the issue is. Maybe you're not saved, or maybe you just misunderstood. But you need to take a step back before you immediately step to the pulpit and start teaching, because right now the fruit that you're producing is not consistent with what Christian fruit should be. Right? You're out here telling people that this is how you serve God, but then you're showing favoritism. You're out here telling people this is how you should serve God, but you're promoting prosperity theology. You're telling people that this is how you should serve God, and now they're going through this trial and they're not counting it joy because they think that the only reason they can be going through this is because God hates them or is mad at them. When maybe God just appointed them to go through this trial so that he could grow them. Right? And so they're out here teaching this stuff, and it's producing non-Christian fruit. And so he says, back up and figure out what the issue is. Maybe you just have a total misunderstanding of who God is, or maybe you just slightly misunderstood something you need to be corrected. Either way, pull back. Not everybody should be teachers because you will be judged more strictly. And so he's trying to help them out, right? He's not saying this in anger or hatred. He's saying, hey, I want you to avoid that greater judgment, so be cautious. Moving on, end of chapter 3. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good conduct his works in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not coming down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruits, without doubting, without hypocrisy, and the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So what's it saying?
So he's saying, like, let who among you is wise and understanding, which is probably very few, if next to none, of these people he's writing to, right? He's saying, if there is a man, let him come forth and show his good conduct and be a leader in his wisdom.
Huh. See how that kind of ties into the proverb we went through earlier?
It does.
The wise and understanding person, and and how did they, like in Proverbs, how did the wise understanding person demonstrate his wisdom? Where did it start with?
His words.
His words. Right? It started with the words, and then it flowed out into other things. Right? Exactly. Whereas the foolish person, it also started with words. Right? They were out here trying to breed conflict and stuff. All right? Who among you is wise and understanding? Right? It's a rhetorical question, but ultimately, what is he trying to get people to do? Self-evaluate, yes. He's not asking this question like, who is wise and understanding? And we're like, Christopher Sharon's pretty wise and understanding. That's not what he's asking, right? He's not asking them to actually be like, I don't know, I think Brienne's pretty good. No, he's asking you to examine yourself, right? Are you wise and understanding? Well, I'd like to think so, right? That's what these people probably think, right? And that's what he's been getting on to them about. Because he says, you think you're wise and understanding, but your lifestyle isn't totally consistent with that, right? Who's wise and understanding? Okay, well, if you are wise and understanding, let him show by his good conduct his works in the gentleness of wisdom. Right there, he kind of gives us a definition of wisdom in a way. Because maybe let's start off with, what can wisdom not be based off of what he says there?
Question?
What can wisdom not be?
Maybe bad conduct or
Okay.
harshness.
Yeah.
It can't be from earth.
Okay, it can't be from earth.
Can't ultimately come from you because sometimes you'll say things you don't mean. It has to come from God.
Okay.
Oh, is it maybe it can't come from faith alone? Because this is from works. Like it could come in his works, it's through their works.
So I would say it's demonstrated not simply by faith alone, but I think it kind of goes back to kind of how I suggested that he was giving a definition of faith last week, right? What I'm saying that wisdom cannot be is simply knowledge, right? Wisdom and understanding, it cannot simply be a matter of knowledge. Oh, he's wise and understanding because he has a seminary degree. That's not enough. He is wise and understanding because he's read the entire Bible 30 times. That's not enough, right? Wisdom and understanding cannot simply being able to recite the law forward and backwards. It cannot simply be, oh, I have heard the Shema recited every single day since I was a child. That is not equivalent to being wise and understanding. Being wise and understanding cannot be, oh, I was born to the chosen people of Israel. That's not wisdom either. Wisdom is demonstrated through one thing. And what is it demonstrated through? Faith. And what is faith demonstrated through?
Trust.
Wisdom.
Works, right?
Works.
Basically, he's pointing out that wisdom and faith go hand in hand, right? Faith is demonstrated through works. Wisdom is demonstrated through works. Because who's your faith in? God. And where does wisdom come from? God, right? So faith is in God. Wisdom comes from God. Because you placed your faith in God, you get wisdom from God. And both of those things produce good works. See how it all goes together? Bada bing, bada boom. Back in chapter 1, what did he say right after he told people about counting it joy in its trials?
Character.
Oh.
Perseverance.
The perseverance have its perfect effect, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith, doubting nothing. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Right? So see how it all ties together, right? Wisdom, faith, works. Right? Count it joy when you go through trials, because trials, once the trials have their perfect work, trials produce perseverance, and perseverance has its perfect work, so that you'll be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. But if you lack the wisdom necessary to go through this trial faithfully, ask God. But when you ask, you have to ask in faith, because you're not simply looking for knowledge, you have to trust God to actually provide you with the wisdom necessary to get through the trial. So you have faith in God, he gives you the wisdom, and through that wisdom, you have the works necessary to endure everything in life, right? So whatever trial comes your way, you'll be able to go through it, right? And then you could probably be a teacher, right? Because guess what? You'll be able to handle that responsibility because you are relying on God, not on yourself. You're relying on God to give you the wisdom to guide people, not on your own pedigree or your own seminary background or your own knowledge of the Torah. No, you're relying on God in every aspect. To put it in Christian terminology, which he's not really using here, you're learning to follow God's Spirit, right? Rather than relying on yourself, right? That's what he's ultimately trying to get these people to do here. He's talking a lot about works, he's talking a lot about wisdom, but ultimately he's just trying to get them to live by faith, right? That's the whole goal. A lot of times people will try to contrast James's letter with Paul's works, and they'll say, oh, well, James is all about works and Paul's all about faith, and like they'll suggest that they're opposites, but they're both arguing for the same thing. They're just talking about it to different audiences, right? And so over here, Paul's like, no, it's by grace through faith apart from works. There's nothing you can do to be saved, right? It is all by just trusting in the God who created everything. But then Paul immediately follows that all up by saying, now that you have placed your faith in him, live for him. James is doing the same thing. Right? He's saying you need to do works, 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 but all those works need to flow from faith. Right? Because faith is not simply a stagnant thing where it's like, oh, I prayed a prayer 30,000 years ago one Sunday at church camp, or after, I guess church camp would be during the week, wouldn't it? One Tuesday at church camp, I prayed a prayer, and now I'm a Christian. Okay, that's not what faith is. Faith is something you live by. Right? You're not being a faithful spouse if you simply stood across the aisle and said, I do. right? That is you voicing your plans to be a faithful spouse, but you follow it up by being faithful, right? Are you gonna mess up? Yes, but that's where you hope that your spouse will be gracious with you. It's like, hey, I saw you look at that other person. That's my bad. I'm sorry. and you pray that they're gracious, right? And God is gracious, but we demonstrate our faith through actions. So James and Paul are talking about the same thing, and what he's saying here immediately ties back to chapter 1, but a lot of times people miss that because of those pesky chapter and verse numbers, right? But the language here is the exact same. Who among you is wise and understanding? Well, this is the same question he was asking back in chapter 1. Basically, he's just been explaining what it means to do that, right? If any of you lacks wisdom, go and ask God. Well, how do I know if I lack wisdom? All right, well, y'all are all being teachers right now, and y'all have no business being teachers. So let me explain to you why you have no business being teachers. But in order to do that, let's talk a little bit about like being hearers and doers of the word, and let's talk about how faith without works is dead, and let's talk a little bit about the tongue and how y'all are failing to do that. All right, does anybody feel like they're lacking wisdom now? Okay, cool. Now let's go ask God for some wisdom, right? So it all ties back to chapter 1. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good conduct his works in the gentleness of wisdom. So how do you demonstrate your wisdom through good works? Right? What is the nature of these works? How does he explain it?
Gentleness of wisdom?
Gentleness.
Gentleness.
Interesting.
Being gentle.
So this is kind of, I think, ironic. Because if he asked who is wise and understanding, the person who shot their arm up and said, me, would probably immediately disqualify themselves. Because that's not very gentle, is it? Right? I think what he's probably arguing here is that the person who's wise and understanding is not the person who's typically going to be going around calling themselves wise and understanding. It's the person who you look at their lives and you see their wisdom not through them claiming to be wise, but through them living out lives that is genuinely wise, right? Whenever they are going through hardship, they don't abandon God. They're faithful to him. And you know what? They're counting it joy when they face trials. And you talk to them and you're saying, how could you possibly be joyful at a time like this? And they respond and they say, you know what? I don't understand why I'm going through this, but I trust that God has a reason. And if I trust him through this, then I trust that this will teach me endurance. And I trust that endurance will teach me perseverance. And that perseverance will have its full effect so that one day I will trust in God so much I'll be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That's how I can have joy amidst this trial. And you're like, well, crud, that person's pretty wise. You're like, wow, that's crazy. Like usually whenever we go through a trial, we're just like, man, this is terrible. I want to get out of this. I'm not going to lie. James has been affecting my mind even recently. For those, I've talked to some of y'all about this. I have been totally sick for like the last few days. On Sunday for discipleship group, I was miserable. I was just terrible. But like I try to like make it to where you can't tell. Even right now, I'm not feeling great. I'm feeling better than I was yesterday. Yesterday, I felt like I was just like a walking dead person. But it's interesting. It wasn't like my sinuses or anything that were bothering me. It was literally just like my entire body just like aching. I've never been sick like this. I guess it was like the flu or something. I don't know. But it was literally just my entire body just like throbbing and aching in the weirdest places, despite the fact that I hadn't worked out in any weird way, and I had like this severe migraine to where like I literally had to like sit down. It was bad. But as I was like writing in my journal, I was like, I reflect on the Bible, and then at the end I'll like write a little bit about my day, and I found myself like complaining about it a lot, and I was like, God, and I was like, and I even like wrote, I was like, God, please heal me and deliver me from this. And then I was reflecting on James, and I was like, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, God has allowed me to get sick in order to teach me something. I'm not saying that is why he did it. Maybe I just made a stupid choice and somehow got sick. But maybe. And so I started thinking, well, what is something I could learn through this? And I was just reflecting on like, it sounds like kind of, it's theological, of course. But I was like thinking, like the pain that you face in like these mortal bodies, it gives us this longing for the future, like resurrection and the immortality. Like we're like, yes, like where our bodies groan for restoration, right? And then it was crazy. Last night I went to bed. I was sleeping right over there. I sleep here, if y'all didn't know that. I don't sleep in my bedroom because I'm weird. But I went to bed last night feeling horrible. I literally laid in bed at 11 p.m. and I didn't fall asleep till 12:30. Like just was tossing, turning, could not go to bed. Finally fell asleep. Feeling terrible. Like genuinely, I was like, God, I've never felt this way before. Please don't let me die overnight. Like I was like, I don't know what's going on. And then I woke up this morning, and the first thing that went through my head was, wow, I feel a lot better. It was weird. Like I just like woke up, and I was like, wow. Like I've never felt that way like from a sickness before. Usually I have to like get up, and be like, wow, I'm feeling better. As soon as I woke up, I was like, I feel good. And because I'd been reflecting on it, the first thing I did before I did anything else was I said, God, thank you so much. To where the first thing my mind went to was gratitude. And then I was reflecting in my journal later today, after that, and I was like, you know what, God? If I hadn't known the pain of being ill, I would never have quite known the joy of being delivered from that illness, right? And I was reflecting on that, and the whole reason I do that is not to like praise myself, it was because of James, right? I was like, that's how we should conduct ourselves. But in life, so often, we go through like something, we're like, oh, I'm sick, I just want to be better. Whereas like, what if we just slow down and ask like, maybe God has a hand in this, right? Because when I read the Bible, almost everything has a supernatural element to it, right? Even if we don't know that supernatural element, it's not like we're always going to know. For all I know, I did just do something stupid and got sick. But James is arguing, hey, you don't know, right? So the way that you demonstrate your wisdom is not by going around and being like, hi, I'm wise. Are you understanding? I am. That's not how you do it. The way that you demonstrate your wisdom is by living wisely. And then you don't have to tell anybody because everybody's going to know. Everybody's going to be like, you know what? I know that Joseph had the worst day in the world a few days ago, but the way he conducted himself, it's amazing, right? And nobody, like, then your wisdom will speak for itself. You don't even have to open your mouth, which is good because we can't control our mouths, right? Keep the mouth closed and just go do all this other stuff. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good conduct his works and the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This is where James starts getting a little bit harsh, but I like it. What's he saying?
Check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yes! That is a big part of James. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. That, like, literally almost every point James is making is that, right? Not everybody should be teachers. They'll be judged more strictly. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. You have faith and works? All right. Check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? Like, all of that. That's what he's saying. Maybe I can ask the same question I asked before. What can wisdom not be? Or what are not characteristics of true wisdom, according to James? Wisdom from God. Based off verse 14.
Like doing, just in general, not godly works, but just in general, good works to try and increase faith, kind of working backwards, how we talked about, like, you can't do that.
Okay, but maybe just using the language that James uses. Jealousy. Selfish ambition, right? So if you think you're wise, but for some reason you feel a need to prove that wisdom to people, or you don't like it whenever somebody else seems wiser than you are, you're probably not wise. Like, I hate to break it to you, that's not wisdom. That goes back to the proverb we were talking about earlier, right? The wise person is willing to listen, right? The wise person seeks understanding. The wise person doesn't go around thinking that they know everything, because that's not wisdom, right? Nobody knows everything. The wise person is always willing to learn from others. And therefore, you can't be wise if you're jealous of everybody who knows more than you. Because all you're doing is you're reducing wisdom to knowledge, which wisdom is not simply knowledge. Wisdom is something that is lived out. It is knowledge applied. And so if you know things in order to apply it, well, you should want to learn more. And therefore, you shouldn't be jealous of other people who have it better than you, right? And who know more than you. Why might he be saying this to the people that he's writing to?
Because a lot of them are not checking themselves and straighting themselves.
Yes.
They're kind of being like, yeah, this bitter, they show favoritism, they're selfish,
Arrogant.
and they're teaching anyway.
Well, yeah, exactly, right? Like, these people are going out and they're just the way that they're conducting their lives demonstrates that they are living jealous and selfish and arrogant lives, right? They are thinking highly of themselves. They're thinking highly of certain people that God never specified are to be thought more highly of simply because of their social status. And they're looking down upon other people, and they're looking down upon, like he says, no, like, that's not how this works, right? That's not true wisdom. That's not true understanding. True wisdom has to be separated from selfish ambition. It has to be separated from jealousy. True wisdom is simply trying to live faithfully to God in this life. And there's no room for competition in that. It's not like me and Rocky are competing to see who can be more faithful to God. And if we are, it should not be out of selfishness. It should be out of mutual encouragement as brothers in Christ and being like, hey, Rocky, me and you, let's see who can be more faithful to God today. But not because we're genuinely trying to beat the other person, but it's because we're trying to motivate the other person to beat us, right? That's what it should be, right? It should be us getting together to all grow in wisdom, not, yeah, I want to be the wisest person in the room. But I think we're all kind of guilty of that, right? I think all of us like to inherently just be like the best at something, right?
It's ingrained in us.
It is, right? It's earthly, natural, demonic. Oh wait, that's what James is about to say, right? Yeah, this is what it is. Like, we are, like, it's the flesh begging to come out. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant so lie against the truth, right? These people, James over here saying not everybody should be teachers, and they're like, but I want to be a teacher. My friend's a teacher. I want to, like, if he's a teacher, I get to be a teacher. Your friend is equipped. You are not. That's okay. The first step to becoming a teacher is by recognizing that it's not your time yet, right? And so he's saying, if you're striving after these things, and if you feel this bitter jealousness because somebody else is living a godlier lifestyle than you, that's a problem, right? You need to address that, because that's not how we should feel towards one another. Because ultimately, jealousy and bitterness, what does that ultimately lead to between humans? Strife and conflict. Who's the person who produces strife and conflict?
The evil person.
The evil person, as we talked about in Proverbs earlier, right? Whereas, by contrast, what does the wise person try to do?
Bring enemies together.
Bring unity, right? Even amongst enemies. Okay, so what you're saying is that rather than focusing on myself, I should focus on others, right? That's what he's highlighting, right? All these things that these people are guilty of is because they're so focused on themselves, right? Everything they're doing is they want to believe that they are the ones that God approves of. They want to believe that they are the ones who deserve to be teachers. They want to believe that they are the ones who are just living perfectly before God. They are the ones who are truly wise. He says, get your mind off of yourself and look around, right? A truly wise person will serve others, and they won't care about what they get in return, right? A truly wise person will count it joy amidst trials, because they're not serving God because of what they get out of it. They're serving God because they want to serve God, even if it means that their life gets worse as a result, right? That's the whole point. It's get your mind off yourself and stop serving God because you want something from Him. Focus on other people and serve God simply because He deserves to be served, right? If you were to condense the book of James down to one message, that'd probably be it. Humble yourself and stop seeking a gift, right? Just serve the giver and serve one another. To summarize it how his brother Jesus summarized it, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Same message. The wisdom is not coming down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. That's pretty extreme to say. So he's saying, that wisdom you thought was coming from God, where's it actually coming from?
The world.
Demons, ultimately, right? He goes deeper and deeper, right? Earthly. It belongs to the earth. Natural. Well, it belongs to nature in general. He says, you know what? Actually, it goes beyond natural. It goes to the supernatural, but not the Holy Spirit. It's rooted in the demonic. Right? Ultimately, whenever you think you're wise and you still have selfish ambition in your heart, that's a little voice whispering in your ear saying, did God really say that? God knows that if you eat from that tree, you'll become like Him. And you'll be wise. You'll have the knowledge of good and evil. Oh wow. It's almost like go back to Genesis chapter 3, and what was the devil doing? He was trying to give selfish ambition and jealousy and trying to make them wise. And Eve heard his words, and she looked at the fruit, and it was desirable to make one wise. So she ate it, right? This is where sin is rooted in, right? It starts with words that produces selfish ambition and jealousy, and ultimately leads to a life of sin. That's how we arrive at that conclusion, right? For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil practice. Why can he say that? Why is that true?
Because he knows that jealousy and selfish ambition is not something that's rooted in something that God would approve of, and so therefore, if it's not aligned with God, then it's something that's evil.
Yeah. Can you name a sin that isn't rooted in one of those two things? Yeah, because ultimately, why do we sin typically?
Because we want to gain something from
Feel good?
it. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Feel good, yes. Ultimately, when we're doing things to feel good, who are we focused on? Ourselves, right? The way that the old church fathers talked about it, they had a Latin phrase that was called incurvatus in se. It means curved inwards, right? That is the root of all sin. When we curve inwards, it's rooted in pride, right? That's what he's saying. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder in every evil practice. Okay, well, jealousy, that's where I am jealous that somebody else has something that I don't have. And selfish ambition, that's where I am seeking to attain something for myself, regardless of what it costs others. Those are both self-focused, right? They're curved inwards. And he says, that is where there's disorder in every evil practice, right? All evil and all chaos, it's all rooted in us being too focused on ourselves. And so if you are over here claiming that you have received wisdom from God, yet that wisdom is still producing a selfish ambition, I hate to break it to you that even if that wisdom has the form of godliness, it's not godliness. Right? If you're standing at the pulpit preaching prosperity theology, he's saying that's demonic. Because you are you're producing this selfish ambition and jealousy amongst people that God would not produce. True godliness will produce a heart of humility and a heart of selflessness, right? Where you just want to serve others. And so any doctrine that is ultimately encouraging you to focus on yourself is ultimately not rooted in God, right? Unless it is asking you to focus on yourself just long enough to make you realize the need to focus on God, right? That's what he's pointing out there. What's that?
I was going to add, or maybe just check your own heart as well. Sometimes we need to focus on ourselves for a second to check our own heart and see where our thoughts or actions are coming from.
Well, and that's what I'm saying, right? If you have to look at yourself just long enough to realize why you need to look to God. My heart is horrible, look to God. But we live in a culture that's constantly trying to tell us to, love yourself. And, you need to take care of yourself.
Seek your own dreams.
Exactly.
Fulfill what you want.
Yeah, literally we live in America, which is built on the idea of the American dream. Figure out what you want to do and go do it. Well, as Christians, that's not what our goal in life should be. Our goal should be to figure out what God wants us to do and go do it, regardless of whether we want to do it or not. Right? And so you have to realize that if you're living your life by selfish ambition and stuff, that's not right. Right? I have a problem with this in our churches nowadays. Churches will get into competition with one another, right? I remember having these discussions that would drive me nuts, where they'd be like, we want to have this retreat on this weekend, but those other people are having a retreat on that same weekend, and they're going to steal all our people. And I'm like, shouldn't our goal just to be for them to go to church? That should be the end goal, right? Even if we have less people, but we've got this competitive nature, which scares me because that means that our churches might be functioning more like businesses than they are like bodies, which is problematic, right? But it's because we've allowed this to creep in, right? Why do we care about more people going to one church than the other? Because we've defined success by worldly standards, right? A business is successful if it makes a lot of money and if it gets a lot of people going to it. So that's how we define church success as well. In many ways, we've done the same thing that James's readers are guilty of, right? We have taken the worldly concepts of success, called it church success, and that's a problem. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil practice. No wonder churches are willing to do all sorts of worldly things in order to try to draw people in. It's because we've made those things our standards. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruits, without doubting, without hypocrisy. We don't have to break down each of those, even though I want to, but I realize we've already gone over time. We started a little bit later, so I think it's fine. What does he say? Like, what are some of the qualities that stick out to you there?
First is pure, just clean.
Considerate. Full of mercy.
Submissive.
Yeah, so which of those is easy? Yeah, which of those is natural to us?
Yeah.
None? Huh. Well, that's frustrating. You're like, yeah, I'm a wise person. All right, so in what ways have you been challenged lately? What do you mean? Okay, so are you living purely? Oh, is that what wisdom means? Yeah. Okay, are you living peaceably? Oh, is that what wisdom means? Yeah. Okay, are you living considerately with one another? Like, do you often spend your life wondering how other people are doing? Oh, is that what wisdom means? Yeah. Do you submit to the authorities above you? Oh, is that what wisdom means? It's like, you hear all this, you're like, oh, maybe I'm not as wise as I thought. But this is what the Bible's saying, right? You're supposed to live in purity. But you know what living purely requires of you? It requires you to deny yourself. Because we naturally want to do whatever our hearts desire because we want to feel good. But you can't live according to godly wisdom if you're putting yourself first. You have to deny yourself and live purely. Being peaceable, well, that means that I have to not stir up conflict with other people, but also if they stir up conflict with me, I have to choose to overlook it. And I have to choose to be the better person, and even whenever they wrong me, I have to choose to strive for reconciliation. It doesn't mean that I can guarantee reconciliation, but it means I have to try.
Forgive. Right?
It means that I'm not adding to the conflict, I'm trying to strive for peace. You know what that requires? Denial of self. Right? There's a common denominator, right? Denial of your passions, denial of your pride. Considerate. Oh, man. I mean, I spend most of my days thinking about me, and myself, and I, and the most important person, right? I mean, isn't this my world and I'm the main character in the story and everybody else is just like a cameo in my life? Is that not how we typically live our lives? Right? I mean, that's how we treat people, right? I mean, we'll talk to each other now and we'll hang out after Bible study, but throughout the rest of the week, how often do we think of one another? And we're like, yeah, I wonder how Rocky's doing today. I hope he's having a good day. Maybe I should text him. Usually we'll message people whenever we need something from them. But that's not considerate. That's still focusing on ourselves. It's like, oh no! Each of these is really convicting. Submissive. Why do we not submitting?
Because we like focusing on ourselves, and when we focus on ourselves, that's not being submissive.
It's not independent.
Denying ourselves.
Yeah. I'm an American. We signed the Declaration of Independence, and that overrides the Bible. Right?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. But the reason I highlight that is because we live in a culture that prides itself off independence, right? Literally, I mean, you can debate about the morality of it as much as you want, but the reason our nation was created was by rebelling against authority, right? And I think that you feel the effects of that throughout, the world. I mean, look at all the movies for teenagers nowadays. It's all about rejecting your parents' authority and not listening. Even Disney movies, literally Aladdin, Little Mermaid, all those movies. Tangled, it's all about hey, the parent is the bad guy, and I'm not listening to you because I know better. And it's about not submitting. And once again, I don't expect culture to do things biblically. I'm just highlighting that this is the culture that we're raised in. Right? And we have to be aware of this because we don't like submission. And we like to get rid of submission. But biblically speaking, wisdom is submission. But why do you submit?
Because God's in control.
Because God's in control and He's put authority in charge. Even if you don't like the authority.
And He knows best.
Yeah.
He knows what's best for us.
Yeah. James, historically speaking, was killed by the authorities. And he submitted to that death. He didn't do anything wrong. It was only a few years after this too. Right? So we just have to be aware of that. Like, that's part of it. And not only submitting to authorities, submitting to one another in love. Right? Paul will talk about this in Ephesians. Full of mercy. Oh, mercy. That's different than justice. Mercy means that I have to like give people something that they don't deserve, or I have to not give people something that they do deserve, and that's I don't like that, because that means that they're gaining something and I'm losing something in that bet, right? What do I have to gain in that? That's the point. Yes?
You know what it goes against? It goes against that one sensei in Karate Kid.
No mercy? Yes.
mercy,
Yeah.
yeah.
Strike first, strike hard. No mercy. Cobra Kai. Cobra Kai has no place in the Christian dojo. Yeah. Full of mercy and good fruits, without doubting, without hypocrisy. It's like, oh no, he followed that up. He's like, all right. And you can't say you're doing all of this on the outside, whatever, inside you're not. Right? There can be no doubting or no hypocrisy. You can't be a double-minded person. That's what true wisdom is. It is a person who is literally denying themselves in every possible way. It's like, oh. Now you have to go back to that original question. Who among you is wise and understanding? Not a hand is raised. It's like, well, I guess none of us are wise and understanding, because we all can work on this. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, his brother says. For they shall inherit the earth.
Wait, okay. That was King.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there is James chapter 3. Do y'all have anything y'all want to add to that? Also, I do want to apologize to y'all if I did feel all over the place today. I felt like I was all over the place. That's because I am still sick, and like I'm mostly better, but like my mind so I'm barely functioning. But do y'all have anything y'all want to add?
There's a famous saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt you. Words will hurt you.
Yeah, that's, I don't know why they ever taught you that as kids. It's the ridiculous and like dumbest statement in the world. Like, sticks and stones may break my bones, words will never hurt me. That's so stupid, right? Sticks and stones, yeah, they will break your bones, but your bones will heal. Words will like break your spirit, and like it will never heal. Like people, like you can say something to somebody, and they're so young. Like I remember, I remember little comments people made to me when I was a child that I still think about nowadays, and like I've gotten over it, but like it's obviously still there. Like I'm like, wow, that really hurt. And it's crazy. Like words stick with you. I don't know why I don't know what they were trying to accomplish. I think they were just trying people to be tough. Like, hey, this will break my bones. Words will never hurt me. Like I think that was just like what you were supposed to say to a bully to try to like scare them off or something. I don't know. I have no idea what the goal was there, but I think they should have thought of a different tactic. But yeah, so be careful with your words. We actually really didn't even talk about specific application of this. We more just talked about like the argument itself, but I think y'all are smart enough to figure out application. Anything else?
Basically, be careful with what words you choose,
Yeah.
what you let come out of your mouth.
And what offices you seek. But I'm talking about like teaching and stuff like that.
And I think it's just important to note that, like, it talks about faith without works is dead, so it's talking about how important works is, but then it shows that your body is controlled by your mouth. So you doing works is controlled by your mouth. It's such a small thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like it all starts there, right? If the horse is controlled there, and if the whole ship can be controlled by the little rudder, and a whole forest can be set aflame by a small spark, then yeah, it's the small things that matter. And you shouldn't simply be focused on doing, like, that's something we need to recognize. We always focus on doing like these huge acts. Like, what does it mean to be a good Christian? Go on like a mission trip over to like the, I don't know, middle of nowhere and like get 30,000 people saved. Or focus on your words. You know, there's a lot of people who go on mission trips. There's not many people who focus on words. Despite the fact there's an entire chapter in the book of James dedicated to it. And James is one of those books that everybody goes through, but people don't apply it much. And I'm guilty of the same thing. right? But it does start. It starts there, and I think that's just one thing James is trying to get onto them about. It's not about these huge religious actions. It's about the small things. Because religious actions, those can always be, like, you can do those because you're trying to receive the praise of man, right? It's not about how big of a sermon you can preach and how well you preach it. Because you can do that, but guess what? The way Jesus talks about it in the Sermon on the Mount, those people have received a reward, right? The people who preach on the street or who pray on the street corners and who, they offer these huge offerings. I mean, you can do those big religious activities, but the main reward you're going to get for those is the praise of man. What God appreciates is the small stuff that people overlook, right? All because you're gentle with words. It's not like everybody's going to go around and be like, oh my gosh, Brienne is like the best at like controlling her tongue. Most people would probably just be like, oh, that's who she is, right? Like, they're not even going to like notice what it is that makes her that way. They're just going to like probably overlook it. But God sees that, and He knows everything she wants to say and everything that she chooses to say, right? And He sees the difference, and even though nobody else notices it, her Father who sees in secret sees it, and her reward will be great in heaven, right? And so, it all starts with the mouth. Anything else?
I have a story I was told about, kind of rumors and what people say about you. There was this woman, I don't know if it's a true story, there was this woman who just couldn't stop talking about other women. So she goes to her pastor and she's like, I don't know how to stop doing this. And so he's putting her through this exercise. He hands her you know what I'm talking about?
Uh-uh.
He hands her a sack of feathers and he says, take a handful of feathers and on each woman's doorstep, place a handful of feathers on her doorstep. And leave them there, just walk away. And so a week later, she comes back on Sunday and she says, I've done that. And he says, okay, now go pick them all up. And she says, I can't. And he goes, neither can you take back what you say when it's hurtful. And so there's the very...
No, that's true.
Pretty good.
Yeah. And that's something we have to realize. Like, he's pointing out, we all stumble in many ways. Like, even if we chose to perfectly follow this from this point forward, we can't take back the place where we've messed up in the past. But the best way to do it? Apologizing. But in order to do that, you have to own up to it. Right? There have been some times where, like, I will get into an argument with somebody, and I'll have to go, I'll think about it, and I'll be like, I should apologize to them. But that's the hardest thing to do, because then you have to admit that you're wrong, and it feels like losing the argument, but then you realize, wait, isn't being, like, maybe I don't do with the argument, because that's the whole bitter jealousy and selfish ambition thing. But you can't take that back, right? And even if you apologize, sometimes the words you say, it's going to stick. But we have to be careful with that, because the things that we take so lightly will have the biggest impact on other people, right? You can do something very harmful to them with the rest of your body, and they'll forget about it, right? You could break their arm. A few years later, they'll be like, I don't even remember you doing that. I didn't know that you were the one who did it. You say a word to them, they will always remember that. Yeah?
I was just going to say, there's a character in Happy Days, Fonzie.
Fonzie.
He cannot say that he was wrong.
Oh, yeah.
He'll somebody will say to him, oh, I think what you did was a bad thing here. And he's like, no,
Yeah.
I wasn't.
Yeah,
We're
humility
just
is a
like
big
that.
theme for James.
Yeah, that's an example.
Yeah. For sure. Cool. All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you. We thank you. We pray for the safety of all of the people amongst our numbers who are not here today, whether they're just at work or whether they're traveling or all the different things that we know that they're doing. I pray that you will keep them safe and sound, and that, Lord willing, they will be with us again next week. And as we depart from your God, I pray that you will give us not only the wisdom that we need to conduct ourselves rightly, but also the strength and the will to apply that wisdom in our lives, starting with our words, including right now, God. After we pray, we're probably going to hang out for a little bit, and I pray that our conversations will be glorifying to you. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Cool. Oh.
I remember that time of year.
What?
In the scores.